She left one shoe and a city kept telling the rest. Behind the glossy billboards and the lists of benefactors, behind the lacquered salon lemon and the way cameras learned the exact angle of her jaw, Victoria Sinclair carried a private shape that did not fit any headline. People described her with tidy nouns: philanthropist, ornament, fixture. But the terms stopped at the perimeter of what kept her awake. At night, when her lights were dimmed and the guests had been ferried home in silence, she walked a corridor that ran like a seam between the old stone of the neighborhood and the new glass towers. It was narrow and low-lit, an artery of amber lamps and leaning mirrors, the varnish on the floor reflecting 1,000 small, patient lights. In that corridor, her face returned to her late and sometimes asked permission to stay. The city knew her smile. It knew, too, the ledger of names she lent her reputation to. Boards, gala lists, the polite checks that kept the city's civic machines humming. Photographers memorized the tilt of her chin, editors allotted column inches to her outfits. But none of that registered what she measured nightly in the corridor. The tremor in a recollection, the place in a photograph where a voice still echoed. She treated these things like objects in a room she could not arrange to her own liking. Some nights she would stop at a leaning mirror and wait for the reflection to come into order, as if the glass were a patient servant that had merely misread her. Sometimes the glass lagged, as if a memory had been thinking itself into being a moment too late. She walked because the walking moved something else. She did not confess to friends. There were friends, polite and devoted, who inhabited her days with laughter and lacquered flutes. But they watched the public Victoria and did not see the pale map of the nights. Her assistant knew more than a friend, because the assistant's job was to hold small, practical things together: a schedule, a ticket, a last-minute florist. The assistant saved voice messages, cataloged emails, and once, in a quiet hour, transcribed the cadence of Victoria's pauses. In the end, the assistant kept one message that would go on to be quoted and misquoted, and then quoted again, not because it solved anything, but because it insisted on complication. She sounded smaller than on stage, the assistant told a reporter. She left a voicemail that cut off in the middle of a name. If there was a public map to her life, it was neat. The penthouse with its white marble and commissioned art, the charity dinners under crystal chandeliers, the profiles in the weekend magazines that spoke in reverent clichés. But near midnight, the corridor called her away from that neatness. It lived in an older stratum of the city, where storefronts preserved their varnish like a protective skin, and the river left a metallic tang in the air when the tide came up. The corridor smelled faintly of lemon from the salon on its corner. It carried that scent as a way of keeping its edges clear. Amber lamps were set along its length, their warm light pooling into a kind of ledger of small suns. Mirrors leaned, sometimes crowded together, sometimes leaning alone, like tired sentinels. People passed through: the late-night doorman, a courier with a wool parcel, a cleaning woman humming as if to an old tune. But at certain hours, the corridor listened differently. The gala where she met him was for the preservation of old facades, the kind of evening arranged to make loss more palatable in a city that rebuilt itself every season. Glass draped from ceilings like icicles. An organ hummed in a space between songs. Servers moved like a slow current, carrying trays of something chilled to the exact right temperature. Her public smile did what it had always done. It filled the frames cameras required. She posed by a model of a once grand building, its miniature columns precise in their reconstruction. The room tasted of champagne and varnish. Laughter came in rehearsed peals. He was not introduced. He stood among the shadows that clung to the back of the room, his posture the sort of steadiness a hallway cultivates. People later described him with catalogued traits: a man in a dark coat, precise hands. But none of that quite captured the way he occupied thresholds, the way he had the posture of someone acquainted with doors and borderlines. He stepped forward when the crowd thinned, and for the first time in long years spoke to her without the filters of publicity. "You walk at night," he said. The sentence was small, flat, almost throwable in its simplicity. It landed where the cameras could not. Victoria paused because the words fit the corridor's geometry. They were a key cut to the exact outline of her habit. There was no pretense, no dramatics, no attempt to reduce her to a quip for the columnists. He spoke as if he had been keeping a ledger of small private movements, and there, with ink and careful hand, had noted one entry. She felt recognized in a way the world never managed. For the rest of the evening she kept that recognition folded under whatever else she wore. She moved through conversations and offered the expected remarks about restoration efforts. She smiled for photographs. At a certain point she slipped away and returned alone to the corridor. Its amber lamps like a memory recovered. They met again, not by scheduling, but by thresholds. A theater foyer where the velvet still smelled of dust and knitting hands. A balcony that looked down at the river, where fog gathered in a slow, gold-edged sweep. A service entrance where the metal door still had the faint, greasy thumb of a hand that had been here yesterday. Each meeting felt like the tipping of a scale. The keeper did not ask for invitations and made no demands. He observed with the careful attention of a stoic archivist. Nothing flashy, nothing flirtatious, only the steadiness of someone who had presided over entrances and knew the exact angle at which a thing might be set aside. Victoria, who had spent her adult life balancing impressions and impressions of impressions, began to think of her memories as objects with weight. She kept lists, literal and otherwise, birthdays catalogued in her phone, photographs filed in hard drives backed up to clouds, notes on the backs of event cards with names and places and what was said. At night, in the corridor, she unrolled these lists like a museum curator inspecting items for wear. Her ledger became more intimate than any public record. She began to appraise things. Which memory made her stomach tight, which brought the breath to her throat, which repeated like a song she could not stop. Small anomalies began to gather around them like sparks. She would look into a mirror and find her reflection a half-beat late, as if someone had misaligned the film. Captions on old articles shifted, not in a way a proofreader would correct, but as if letters had grown shy. A last name truncated here, a pronoun dropped there. Objects returned but altered. An old fan with an unfamiliar ribbon. A brooch with a different clasp. She told herself not to believe in supernatural solutions because the city required plausible explanations. Seasonal renovations, editing errors, human forgetfulness. These were tidy, socially acceptable answers. But there were moments when the air itself felt slowed, when the river's tang sharpened into something metallic and precise, and the corridor's amber lamps hummed in a register that felt like attention. Neighbors began to notice. The bookstore owner on the corner, a person who wore his hair as if in perpetual descent from the modern, kept a book propped open near the register with marginalia that read less like commentary and more like a running weather report of the strange things people brought to him. He had a habit of penciling dates in the margins and circling certain lines in books as if the margins themselves might stitch together a story. When Victoria came in once to buy an old journal she did not need, the owner slid it across with a sideways look and a quiet observation that stayed in her pocket like a pressed flower. "People come to me with missing pages," he said. "Sometimes they want them back. Sometimes they want them to stay gone. Not all missing pieces were sorrow's medicine." On one evening the theater's playbill shuffled its credits. Actresses' names appeared displaced, an understudy credited in a photograph for a role she had not played. The city, which liked to tidy anomalies into gossip, offered a dozen explanations: a printing error, an intern's oversight, a collective misremembering that had become contagious. Children turned the corridor into a rumor-fueled darescape. They dared one another to leave something at the seam and wait for the corridor to take it. They whispered of a watcher who rewarded forgetfulness and punished greed. The city's chorus, gossips and journalists, scholars and curators, baristas and midnight tram riders, began to convert absence into narrative. Victoria's ledger, literal and figurative, began to thin in places she had not intended. She woke one morning with a memory missing like a tooth. She could feel the absence as a smoothness where an edge had been. A photograph of a summer evening with a certain laugh had a face blurred as if the lens had been embarrassed. She was not afraid at first. The relief was immediate and small, like a bandage removed from a tender place. Nights became lighter by degrees. There was, in the thinning, a quiet balm. She could unhook the ache that had clung to a particular street corner, or the mutter of a name that kept returning as an echo. The keeper's interventions were not announced as miracles. They arrived like small edits in a draft, an erasure that left the sentence cleaner and a little less true in the way of stories that have been smoothed. The reprieve, however, was not free. It was not a billing of items with prices, a ledger outside of morality. The trader, if he could be called that, never offered a list or a schedule. He spoke of thresholds and seamwork as if they were vocational details. He would glance at her hands and then at a leaning mirror and comment on the way light pooled in the room. He arranged a few scenes with a care that felt ceremonial. A room where frames hung, but glass had been removed. A table laid with a single napkin. A lamp with an amber bulb echoing the corridor. He never made promises. One night he opened that room the way one opens a kept envelope. The walls were papered with photographs whose surfaces were smudged as if someone had tried to see through them. Frames sat without glass, their edges neat and expectant. He moved with tools of silence, his gestures precise, his presence like an even breath in a chamber that had been designed by someone who catalogues openings. He did not present a contract. He did not make grand declarations. He held out a hand where a small table bore an ivory brooch, not ornamented with value, but with the pale, personal weight of a thing that belonged to someone's body. "You cannot bear that which will not let you sleep," he said once. But he did not instruct, and he did not cajole. Victoria understood hours of reflection before she permitted herself to place anything on the table. There are ways to inventory grief that look like prudence. A pros and cons list written in a small, neat hand. Late-night conversations with people who will not shame you for thinking of desperate things. She thought of the ledger again and imagined each memory like an object on a shelf. Which one, she asked herself, was the heaviest? Which rattled loose at the wrong times? Sometimes she opened the compartment where certain evenings lived and found only a smell, lemon and river tang, and the rest was dark. The choice was hers, and the quietness of the room reinforced that she was choosing. When she lifted the brooch from the table, it felt at first as if she were holding a small animal, familiar, warm, a thing that might purr. It had been a gift once, a part of a season of her life when grief had been something others recognized and had an etiquette for. Now it lay in her palm like an emblem of that season. She felt ridiculous in front of the man who kept doors. She felt steady. She placed the brooch on the table and, in doing so, relinquished more than the object itself. The seam in the room shifted open like a mouth that had been waiting to be spoken into. It was not loud. It had the sound of a page turning. She stepped forward, balancing her own composure like an actress balancing the next moment of a play. The hem of her dress caught on something, and the moment was human and small. A shoe snagged, slipped, and left behind on the floor a single white thing by a lamp. She noticed, even as the seam took her, the way the room arranged itself with curious care. The empty frames seemed to accept the missing glass as if it were a customary absence. She did not feel dissolved or rescued. She felt as if she had submitted to a long-held draft on a page, a line that had wanted to be severed from the sentence. There was relief, yes, but it came bundled with a particular tenderness. You could see it in the way she did not run. You could see it in the economy of her exit. One shoe, as if the rest of her left intact but for an island of forgetfulness that would float away from her life. When the penthouse woke the next morning, its surfaces gleamed with the ritual cleanliness of expectation. The decorative pillows were plumped. The coffee maker did not know what had been missing. In the pages of the city's morning updates, there would later appear all the wild things people fill absences with: conjecture, conspiracy, 1,000 eager metaphors. Some journalists wrote about vanishment with the flourish of headline writers. Others tried to compress the event into a tidy column about the psychological pressures of public life. Street blogs favored an edgier theory, that she had staged a disappearance to sell a memoir. The city, which lives by narrative, began to iterate the story and in doing so altered its edges. Not everyone trusted the tidy explanations. Her assistant kept the last messages she had been given, the last orders for flowers, the last dinner reservations. There was a recording, short and garbled, captured 2 nights before the crossing. "I'm going to the corridor," Victoria had said, voice low with something between decision and instruction. The message broke off mid-name. The assistant kept that fragment like a relic. When the reporters came calling, the assistant offered it with the hesitance of someone who knows how easily context can be misread. She sounded like she had already planned how to make herself calm, the assistant said. She wasn't running. She was preparing. The bookstore owner had his own collection of visitors who came to him after the news. Teenagers stitched together dares into an urban game. Leave a trinket at the seam and wait for the corridor to return it, they said, as if the corridor had a conscience. Children left matchboxes and bottle caps and came away with conversations that had lost a name. They come to me for maps, the owner said once. But what they want is to find an exit they can believe in. He kept the marginalia and began to paste press clippings into an oversized ledger, arranging them by tone: pity, suspicion, longing. A scholar, one who wrote essays about the city's myths, invented a taxonomy in a column that read less like a taxonomy than a mournful elegy. He traced the story's geography: corridor, riverbank, theater, places the city had invested in ritual and then abandoned to new commerce. He quoted pedestrians and cited the assistant's voicemail with an archival reverence, and built his argument slowly, the way an archivist lays down maps. He called the phenomenon a threshold grief, a phrase that nested comfortably into the city's appetite for labels. Yet even in his learned piece, the scholar could not supply origin for the keeper. He acknowledged the absence with a scholar's candor. Some things, he wrote, must remain unclassified because classification would be a theft of mystery. Pilgrimages began with curiosity and hardened into ritual. Women in shawls would stand at the corridor entrance, wearing necklaces they hoped the watcher would acknowledge. Teenagers dared each other to trudge down the seam and leave behind a coin or a scrap of clothing and then run back to test whether the city would respond with small alterations. Some came home changed in ways that were intimate and difficult to measure. A name that in conversation no longer surfaced. A recollection that had gone blank like a bad film. Others did not return, or rather they returned but with a different topography of self. They might speak of seasons in ways that no longer fit the pattern of their prior life. Rumors spread and multiplied. The keeper became a figure in late-night forums and whispered conversations, a presence described and redescribed, until the original encounter's restraint had been softened by the city's appetite for drama. He was a watchmaker of doors to one teller, a compassionate thief to another. Some insisted he offered relief. Some said he took pieces that would have been valuable later. A few claimed he made trades with the dead. The city, always eager to domesticate mystery, turned him into a symbol more than a being. But for those who had been close to Victoria, the story remained stubbornly particular. Her friends remembered the way she laughed at small and private jokes. They remembered the way she insisted on a certain lemon in the salon's mixture. How she would trace the grain of varnished wood with a fingertip. They were at a loss for an explanation that did not simplify the complexity she had cultivated for years. They loved her with an inventory of good works, with the language of social life that meant something but lacked access. The scholar collected testimonies, an assistant's fragmentary message, the bookstore owner's penciled dates, a child's account of a cancelled dare, and wrote them into an essay that acknowledged ambiguity as its subject. He proposed that the city needs its myths to shape absence, that we compress grief into stories so we can carry it without being toppled by it. If myth-making is a communal action, then the keeper had become the city's scapular, the small relic that neighborhoods could touch and find permission to talk about what they feared about being known and not private. His piece did not conclude. It ended on a question. What do we do with the bits of ourselves that make us unbearable to live with? Years went by, and the corridor kept its lamps, the amber light as faithful as a memory that refuses to age. Children tried new dares. Adults took new pilgrimages as if testing their own mettle. The magazine features who once described Victoria in neat profile pieces turned to retrospective essays. There was a paragraphy chronology, photographs lined with timestamps. And in a drawer somewhere, people discovered the oddities. A photograph where Victoria's laughter was blurred. A Gala program missing a printed name. The city had not solved the mystery. It had, if anything, turned it into language. One day a small notebook surfaced, its pages narrow and plain. The kind of object one buys in a stationery store and keeps because the paper takes ink like an honest friend. It was found between the pages of a returned book at the bookstore, tucked in as if it had been a bookmark, or perhaps slipped there on purpose. Inside, in Victoria's neat hand, was a single, unadorned sentence. I traded what would not let me sleep. The line was unpadded. It carried guilt and mercy without claiming virtue. It did not explain how the trading had occurred, or what precise mechanism lay behind the seam. It offered instead a confession of agency and a hint of sorrow. a concise memoir that refused either to plead or to lecture. That sentence traveled as sentences do, quoted in op-eds, spoken of in podcasts that favored the elegiac, embroidered into arguments about celebrity and privacy. Yet the notebook did not satisfy the city's hunger for certainty. It gave a trace, a human hand admitting the shape of a choice, and then left the contours open for interpretation. People argued that the phrase was brave. Some said it was evasive. Others simply liked the rhythm of it and wrote it down in their own small books. In the bookstore, the owner kept the notebook in a drawer and sometimes took it out to read the sentence as if he were tasting a small, precise pain. When asked why he had not returned it to the assistant or to the family, he would only shake his head and say, "Some sentences want to live in the open, not explained." The assistant, when dealing with calls and inquiries that arrived in the wake of discovery, offered a gentle correction to the rush to narrate. "She chose," the assistant would say. "She knew what she wanted." The word "she" was emphasized without sermon. It was a fact whose tone was both liberating and melancholic. The city, as it always does, turned the corridor and its keeper into ritual. Weddings were photographed on its edge for the novelty. Dare maps were printed in the back of free weekly papers. A fringe of tourists came in cautious curiosity. Children still left matchboxes and bottle caps, but they also left kinder things. Cards that said "For Peace" in clumsy handwriting, small knitted squares, a dried leaf pressed between paper. None of these items stood as proof of anything beyond the city's capacity to generate hope and myth. If there was a moral, it was private. The act of choosing. This is what the notebook made clear. Victoria was not a passive vessel of the city's appetite. She had weighed mass against relief, ledgered memory, and decided which of her own parts would be excised for the sake of being able to continue living inside her skin. The fact of the choice did not simplify the complexity of what had been given up. Erasure can be mercy. It can also be loss. The keeper, in whatever category he might later fit, offered an exchange that was not a contract, but a quiet arrangement. The city, hungry for tidy endings, made legends in the margins and wrote what it could into form. The thing that remained, insistently human and small, was the shoe. No one could quite say if she had planned to leave it. The seam might have been meant to take all of her. Perhaps she had planned to walk away so smooth that no trace would be left. But a shoe, imperfect in its abandonment, sat by a sofa as if a human being had been briefly forgetful. People traveled to see it, some with sympathy, some with a want of spectacle. They left flowers occasionally, but mostly they left coins and notes. The shoe became a kind of altar, an object that made absence legible. In the amber corridor, the lamps continued to burn with their patient glow. Mirrors leaned and occasionally lagged. At the riverbank, fog gathered and the metallic tang in the air insisted on its presence. The keeper remained a presence in the city's stories, sometimes tenderly spoken of, sometimes feared, sometimes invoked in the way one might mention a storm to explain a broken fence. He kept doors and watched seams. He never became a label. He remained ambiguous by virtue of being the city's answer to its own difficulty in holding loss without explanation. Years later, when someone would ask the scholar if the keeper was kind, the scholar would smile with the softened expression of someone who had fallen in love with the ambiguity of stories. He offered a way out, the scholar said, and that is neither wholly kind nor wholly cruel. It is human and therefore complicated. The assistant would not comment on kindness or cruelty. She would cite facts, messages, a lunch order, the list of items she had been instructed to keep. The bookstore owner would only say, "I sell maps. People make their own routes." The city continued to build itself anew, but the corridor remained as if set in amber. Tourists and locals alike moved through the seam, sometimes leaving offerings and sometimes leaving nothing at all. The ledger of the city had a new entry now, a ritual of possibility in the margins, a place where one might step out of the narrative one had been given and into a space where forgetting was possible. What people did with that possibility was their own business. Victoria's notebook line appears in the margins of essays and as a quote on stairwell plaques. "It is not a solution, it is a trace. I traded what would not let me sleep." The sentence rests there like a coin on velvet, no more, no less. It implies agency and a taste for relief. It implies sorrow. It implies that someone chose to make an absence legible. Behind luxury and fame, she loved a non-human being in the sense that she loved a relief that was not simply another social role. That love was intimate, quiet, careful. It was not romantic in the way the world uses the term, nor was it a grotesque bargain. It was a thing between a woman and the architecture of thresholds. The city told itself other stories, because stories are how cities keep grief from becoming immeasurable. Those other stories are not false. They are simply transformations, the way an old building becomes a museum of its own ruin. If you are the kind of person who follows stories of streets that keep secrets, who knows that a city's neatness often hides private negotiations with sorrow, stay with these kinds of tales. If this particular seam of the city has threaded something into you, subscribe for more stories that live in the spaces between light and shadow. Time moves on. Names shift with the seasons. But the corridor's amber lamps still burn, mirrors still lean, occasionally misbehaving. Somewhere between varnish and river tang, between salon lemon and the blank page of a small notebook, the keeper keeps watch. People will continue to visit the seam, to leave objects out of curiosity, devotion, or desperation. The city will continue to make myth from absence, to write columns that tidy and essays that complicate, to keep the ledger thick with interpretations. And in an apartment that remains immaculate in its memory, a single shoe sits by the sofa, a small, stubborn testament to a choice made in the half-light between fame and private life. The shoe is not explanation. It is a remnant, a human punctuation mark that insists upon something the city will not let go of. The fact that some trades are made quietly, in thresholds, and that people sometimes choose not to be entirely known in order to be able to sleep. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who walks the city at night and keeps secrets of their own.